seeks to get total control over its citizens. So you think of a dictatorship where people can't even really think for themselves. There's no freedoms. So like as far as political and economic freedoms, right? You have no voting rights. You cannot start your own business or anything like that. Completely controlled by the government. For social, intellectual, and cultural, okay, this basically means that the government is going to brainwash the population so that they think and act a certain way, and they do not allow for any freedom of thought or any other ideas besides the one that the government comes up with.
So would that be like what I was talking about before with like, I forgot where it was, but like a part of Africa where like they can't talk about the king?
Yes. Does anyone know of any other examples of totalitarianism today? There's one that
I
pops
use the
up.
bathroom, please.
Yeah, go ahead.
North Korea.
North Korea is the most popular. Go ahead.
I can go.
North Korea is the most popular one that people look at today as being a totalitarian government. If any of you guys have ever gone down like the YouTube rabbit hole about North Korea videos, you might see videos where the citizens seem particularly brainwashed and acting kind of strange. That would be a totalitarian government. Anything that shows evidence where the citizens are completely thinking a certain way because the government brainwashes them would be an example. Does anyone know the first country that started doing this? It's around this time period.
Russia.
Russia's one of them, but not the first. Not China. No.
Germany.
Japan.
Not Germany.
Vietnam. Somalia.
America.
Italy.
Yeah.
Okay, does anyone know who the leader was?
Oh, Mussolini.
Benito Mussolini. Good.
Yeah, buddy.
Okay, so Mussolini is going to start a new political philosophy called fascism, which he will then later turn into a totalitarian government. So this is on page 2. So if you scroll down to page 2, you'll be able to see the chart for this, and then we'll go back up to page 1. It was just a big chart, so I decided to move it onto the second page. So the first aspect, right, there's 6 things that a government must be doing that would make them fascist. Okay, 1, they need to focus on nationalism rather than individualism. So all of their propaganda and all the different things they're using to manipulate their population would be focused on people being all in for the country, right? They're only doing things to help the country. They're not trying to advance their own ideas or their own life. You're only working to better the entire country, and this is in an extremist way. So, like, for example, if you're in a very nationalistic country like this and it's extreme, okay, the best job you could ever have would be like joining the military, right? So as a kid growing up, that's like what people look at as the best job, right? Maybe in America you'd think about being an entrepreneur or being a doctor or something like that. But if it's in a fascist state, it would be being in the military.
Would military people get paid a lot? Much more than anybody?
The top people, yeah. The top people in the military. It's always going to be led by a dictator. So one ruler with total control, or maybe a small group of people with total control. There's no individual rights whatsoever. So any sort of freedom of speech, freedom of expression, any freedom that you think of that you have in the United States, you would not have in a fascist state. The economy is completely controlled by the government. So you do not have a right to do anything to make money for yourself, whether that would be starting a business, having your own farm, anything like that. Right? Any way where you would make your own money, that would not be acceptable. The government owns all the businesses. Now this is different than communism a little bit, because in communism there's a redistribution of wealth. Right? So they're taking all the income or all the food and then ideally, right, then spreading it out equally. In fascism, there really is no desire to do that. There are still different social classes in that. It's just determined by the government. What do you think might be something they would use to determine how much money you would get in a fascist government? Jake, go ahead. Any ideas? Yeah.
Job?
Yeah, so how would they determine who gets what jobs?
Family history?
Okay, so maybe some family history. What does the dictator want most from the people?
Allegiance.
Allegiance or loyalty, right? So maybe loyalty would also be involved. They also will use violence, fascist government, so they will have some sort of police force that will ensure that anybody who would be against the government or anyone who would, for example, if you're thinking about, Mussolini's Italy, if there was some anti-Mussolini gathering, right, this police force would go in there, break it up, arrest anybody who was part of it. So any sort of threat to the government at all would be shut down using violence. And then the last thing they do is, one, the military is very glorified, and secondly, the youth is very glorified. Why do you think they would glorify the youth? Yeah.
Because they're more able to work than the older people or the younger people.
Okay, good. So they're more. So in the future, they'll definitely be the workers. Good. What else is, if you're trying to manipulate your population, what is good about targeting the youth? Yeah. Way easier to influence, and we'll kind of get into that later on. But they all had these youth camps, where when you were young, you would go to it, and basically when you would leave, you'd be like, Mussolini's the best, Hitler's the best, and they basically were brainwashing camps. So who else practiced totalitarianism?
Do we go up now?
Oh, you need me to go back?
No, go up to the first page.
Yes, now you're back up on the first page. Okay, there's Mussolini, Hitler, Stalin, and then in Japan, Hideki Tojo and Emperor Hirohito. This would be who practiced it. And some important things here. Right, Mussolini was a fascist. Hitler was a fascist. Stalin was a communist. Okay, and Tojo and Hirohito were more of a military-style government. So they were all totalitarian, but they used different platforms or different styles of government in order to control their population. So they are a little bit different. So don't think as like fascism and totalitarianism as the same thing. They can be, both can be characteristics of a government at the same time, but not necessarily. Okay. So how did they rise to power? How did all these people who throughout history are looked at as some of the most evil people in the entire world? Well, first of all these nations are we're all in the Great Depression and we're in a terrible state. So that being said, you have all these people suffering, all these people who are hungry, all these people who are poor, jobless, maybe even homeless, and you have these leaders come in and they are trying to appeal to that audience in the country. They're going to say things like, listen, we will have jobs for you. We will have food. You won't need to worry about the basic necessities of survival. And if you're coming from a situation where every day you're trying to figure out how to eat, that's going to appeal to you. That's really all you need to hear, right? Because you know it'll be easier for you than it was before. So that was one of the main things that these leaders targeted. Also, they blamed the Treaty of Versailles for a lot of their problems. When you think about all the countries who end up adopting totalitarianism, all right, one, you have Germany, who obviously would resent it. They resent it the most with the reparation payments and the land that was taken away from them and the restrictions put on their country. Okay, a leader coming out and saying the Great Depression's bad, I'm going to fix it, and those countries that took away from us in the Treaty of Versailles will pay for it, people would rally behind that. Also, the other countries like Italy was promised land during the Treaty of Versailles. They didn't get it. Japan was promised things too, and they were underappreciated during the treaty signing. So these things are going to lead to anger and resentment towards those countries that did take away some of their rights or some of the things that they had before, promises that they had been given. And then lastly, all these nations are weak, right? You don't really see a totalitarian government rise in a country that's doing well. It's always when they're struggling the most and a leader comes in that appears to be strong, who's a good speaker, who's charismatic, and can promise people things like basic necessities that they need. Okay, if you're in a country where everyone's well educated, everyone's well fed, there's lots of jobs, it's hard to get people to rally behind someone who's saying, by the way, I'm going to have total control of the government and you're going to do whatever I say. So that's going to play a big role. Okay, so the next thing we're going to go over is how they get total control. There's 3 aspects. What I mean by getting total control is when they originally get put into office, they're not just right off the bat going to be able to manipulate and brainwash their population. At first, they just appear to be a leader who's trying to help the common people of the nation. Okay, so how did they get to this point where everybody follows them? Well, their first and most important tactic is intimidation. So in the short term, right when you get into power, one thing that these people do is they'll have secret police forces. So Hitler uses something called the Gestapo. Mussolini has the black shirts. They're basically the same thing. They're this secret police force that does whatever the dictator says. And their job is to intimidate anybody who would have any negative feelings towards the government. So if there was anti-Hitler meetings going on somewhere, and the Gestapo broke the door down of some place where the meeting was happening, roughed the people up in there who were saying bad things about Hitler, and arrest a few of them, that's going to show the rest of the country, don't do that, or else you're going to end up like these people. Mussolini did the same thing. He just called his secret police force the black shirts, but it was basically the exact same idea. Has anyone ever heard of a gulag before? What is it, Earl?
Like a Russian jail.
Alright, so they were Russian jails under Stalin that were in Siberia. Does anybody know anything about Siberia? Yeah.
Really cold.
It's got some of the coldest weather in the entire world. And basically they were labor camps where if you did anything against the government, they would send you to the labor camp and work you to death. That's essentially why Stalin actually killed more people than Hitler, because he sent so many people to these gulags or these labor camps where they worked until they died. Yes, Justin.
Wait, if they're labor camps, like what kind of labor would they do?
Basically useless labor where they'd be like breaking rocks up.
Wait, Stalin killed more people than...
About double.
So they break up rocks for like no reason?
Yeah, they would just do work that was pointless.
That's,
And lastly, this also promotes nationalism. So basically, they intimidate anybody who's not buying into the country being the best in the world and isn't trying to support that agenda. So if you weren't buying into that, that's who they would intimidate. So I had some pictures to show you. Here's a picture of the German Gestapo doing like a stop on the side of the road. Okay, in Japan, they would do public executions to anybody who would go against the emperor. So that's just, one way they would intimidate their people.
Is that a little boy or a man?
Looks like a teenager. Okay, this is a Russian gulag. Yes, all those things behind that man are dead bodies. Just to show you how much things piled up there. Pretty gruesome image. All right,
is he smiling?
another way, it looked like he did have a strange smirk on his face. Another thing that they did to get control was this excessive use of propaganda. So we've talked about propaganda before in this class in World War I. We particularly looked at that one American picture which you guys saw about the mad brute. You guys remember that one?